Just past 1 in the morning on January 16th, 1997, a young man knelt beside a dark green Mercedes convertible on the shoulder of Interstate 405 in the Sepulveda Pass. He was wrestling with a flat tire, and he'd already used his car phone to ask a friend to come keep him company while he changed it. Within a few minutes, a stranger approached him out of the darkness, demanded his money, and fired a single round into the side of his head. The 27-year-old who died there at the edge of the off-ramp was the only son of one of the most recognized entertainers in the United States. His death would set off one of the most heavily covered investigations in Los Angeles in a generation. Ennis William Cosby was born in April of 1969 in Los Angeles, the third of 5 children born to Bill and Camille Cosby and the family's only boy. He grew up between Massachusetts and California, attending Morehouse College in Atlanta and graduating with a bachelor's degree in 1992. After finishing up his bachelor's, he enrolled at Columbia University's Teachers College in New York. By the mid-1990s, he was deep into a master's program in special education there, and he'd recently begun working toward a doctorate. His research focused on learning disabilities, an interest that came from his own life. While he was at Morehouse College, he had been diagnosed with dyslexia, and this instilled in him a deep desire to help others with similar learning disabilities. By the time he died, Ennis had spent years working in the field, including teaching at an elementary school in New York and a summer at Landmark College in Vermont. He had a quiet, almost shy demeanor, and people often described him as the most grounded member of a family whose name lived on billboards. He drove a flashy convertible, sure, but his ambitions were relatively modest by the standards of his last name. He wanted to open a school for kids with dyslexia. In January of 1997, he had flown out to spend time with his family, do work on his dissertation, and visit longtime friends. A friend named Stephanie Crane lived off Mulholland Drive in the hills above the Sepulveda Pass. She and Ennis had agreed to meet that night at her place. He'd been driving his mother's dark green Mercedes-Benz convertible, and he set out from a friend's home in the city shortly before 1 in the morning. He never made it. On the southbound shoulder of the 405, just north of the Skirball Center Drive exit, the Mercedes blew a tire. Ennis pulled off as far as he could, parked beneath the freeway lights, and called Stephanie on his phone to let her know what had happened. He asked if she could drive down, position her car so its headlights faced his, and stand by while he changed the tire. She agreed, grabbed her keys, and got into her own car to meet him. When Stephanie arrived a short time later, she pulled in behind the Mercedes and waited for Ennis to walk over. Instead, a man she didn't recognize appeared at her driver's side window, and he spoke through the glass, telling her in a low voice to open the door or he'd hurt her. She didn't open it, put the car in gear, and drove forward maybe 50 feet, away from the man, and stopped again. A moment later, she heard what she believed was a loud shot. When she turned around and drove back, the man was gone, and Ennis was on the ground beside the open driver's side door of his Mercedes. A single bullet had entered his head at close range. He still had cash in his pocket and an expensive watch on his wrist. These two details complicated the prevailing theory that this had been a straightforward robbery gone wrong. After all, these were things that the attacker could have grabbed within seconds, though some believed that the presence of Stephanie made the robbery impossible. And trust me when I say it, the actual reason the attack happened was so much more disturbing than a robbery, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Stephanie placed an emergency call, and paramedics from the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived within minutes. There was nothing they could do, and he was pronounced dead at the scene a short time afterward. The Los Angeles Police Department's West Bureau unit took over within hours, and what they found was a crime scene that was unusually clean. They had no clear fingerprints from the assailant, no shell casing they could match to a known weapon, and at first only Stephanie's description of the man at her window. He was a slender white male in his late 20s or early 30s wearing a knit cap. What they did have, recovered from the brush near the off-ramp, was a black knit wool cap that the attacker seemed to have discarded. It was the kind of detail that easily could have been overlooked, but forensic technicians lifted enough material from inside the cap to begin building a genetic profile. In the meantime, the story was everywhere, and while the name Bill Cosby carries certain darker connotations now, this wasn't the case at the time. Bill Cosby was, at that moment, one of the most beloved entertainers in the country, someone who was affectionately known as America's Dad due to his role on The Cosby Show. The slaying of his only son hit the news cycle with the kind of force that left investigators wading through hundreds of tips a day. Most of them were useless, and some pointed to a professional hit, since Bill Cosby had been the target of a long-running extortion campaign, which police were well aware of. Someone claiming to be his biological daughter was asking Cosby for tens of millions of dollars, or they'd take the story to the press. The ringleader of the extortion scam was at that point being prosecuted by the feds. Some investigators believed that this attack was done to silence Bill Cosby and stop him from testifying in that case. While this wouldn't be the reason why this happened, this is somehow less disturbing than the actual reason for the attack. By early March of 1997, with no arrest in sight, the National Enquirer announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to the gunman's capture and conviction. The tabloid Globe added a separate offer of its own, and the reward changed the dynamic of the case almost overnight. It made the difference between someone keeping a friend's secret and someone picking up the phone. Within weeks, a young man from the Los Angeles area contacted the Enquirer and said he knew who'd done it. The caller was a man named Christopher So, a young acquaintance of an 18-year-old Ukrainian-born immigrant named Mikhail Markasev. According to So, Markasev had bragged in the days after the shooting about confronting a wealthy man on the side of a freeway. According to So's account, he asked for money, and then blasted him when the man hadn't handed it over fast enough. That was literally it. He picked a random guy to rob, and thought it was hilarious that he ended his life when Ennis didn't move fast enough to hand over the cash. So also told investigators where Markasev had reportedly hidden the weapon in a wooded area not far from the shooting scene. Detectives from West Bureau moved on the lead almost immediately, since So seemed to have information that wasn't publicly available at the time. They obtained search warrants and, with So guiding them, located a revolver hidden in the brush. Ballistics tied the weapon to the round from the scene, and the genetic profile pulled from the wool cap matched a sample taken from Markasev. By March of 1997, just under 2 months after the shooting, the 18-year-old was in custody, charged with the slaying of Ennis Cosby and the attempted robbery that preceded it. The arrest itself was relatively quiet, and officers picked Markasev up without incident. He didn't run, he didn't resist, and by all accounts he didn't even seem particularly surprised. He just asked for a lawyer and largely stopped talking after that. The reward money, after some back and forth about how it would be distributed, eventually went to Christopher So. The Markasev who began appearing in court was a slightly built young man with a hard stare, someone who really didn't seem all there. He'd come to the United States from Lviv as a child, had drifted in and out of trouble through his teens, and had already been arrested once for an earlier incident involving a weapon. The night of the shooting, by his companions' accounts and grand jury testimony, had been a restless drive looking for someone to rob. They hadn't been targeting anyone in particular, and they hadn't known whose car they were pulling up behind. The randomness was part of what made the case so disorienting when the facts came out, and I think random crimes like this fill us with an extreme sense of discomfort. I think we want to believe that things happen for reasons, good things and bad things, not that horrific things can happen entirely randomly. The trial began in the summer of 1998 in a downtown Los Angeles courtroom. His defense team argued that the prosecution's witnesses were unreliable, that the DNA evidence was overstated, and that the weapon could have been planted to claim the reward. The defense also tried, with no success, to suggest that another young man named Eli Zakaria, who'd been with Markasev on the night in question, was the actual shooter. The prosecution walked the jury through the timeline carefully. Markasev and his friends had been driving around the west side of Los Angeles that night, looking by their own later account for someone to rob. They'd taken the 405 north, exited near the Skirball, and stopped when they saw the Mercedes pulled over. Markasev, by every account except his own, had stepped out of the car and approached Ennis on foot, while the others waited a short distance away. Bill Cosby himself testified during the trial. His appearance on the stand was a national news event, and his composure was widely remarked upon. He spoke quietly about identifying his son's body, about the kind of person Ennis had been, and about the call he received in the early morning hours, informing him of what had happened. The defense didn't cross-examine him at length, and by most accounts, the jurors looked stricken during his testimony. The jury deliberated for less than a day, and on July 7, 1998, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Markasev was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but despite this, he showed little reaction in the courtroom. The verdict made the front page of every major paper the following morning. The case, for the moment at least, was finally closed. For 3 years after the conviction, Markasev maintained that the verdict was a miscarriage of justice, and his attorneys filed appeals. His mother gave occasional interviews insisting on his innocence, that her boy couldn't have done what the jury said that he did. And then, in early 2001, Markasev wrote a letter from prison, addressed to the Deputy Attorney General handling his appeal, asking that all of his pending appeals be withdrawn. In the letter, he admitted that he had been the shooter and that the jury was absolutely correct in the conclusion it drew. He said he wanted to take responsibility for what he'd done, that continuing to fight the conviction was an act of dishonesty he could no longer maintain. He said that he'd become a Christian during his time in prison and wanted to make peace with what he had done. The letter was, in many ways, the final piece of the puzzle that the trial had largely settled. It removed any doubt about whether the right person had been convicted, and it also removed the lingering suspicion that he hadn't acted alone. In the years after his death, the Cosby family established a foundation in his name, the Hello Friend, Ennis William Cosby Foundation. This foundation is dedicated to supporting research and educational programming for individuals with dyslexia and other learning disabilities. The rather unusual name for the foundation came from one of Ennis's own habits. He had a way of greeting strangers and old friends alike with the same opening line, "Hello, friend." Markasev, for his part, remains incarcerated in the California state prison system more than a quarter century after his sentencing. His 2001 letter has been the last major statement to come out of the case from the man responsible for it. He has given no interviews, granted no documentary access, and made no further public attempt to explain what he did or why. I've covered literally thousands of cases at this point, and I'm somewhat fascinated by the way Markasev ultimately took responsibility for the sick action that took the life of an innocent man. He appears to have fully and completely accepted his fate and his punishment for what he did, in a way that's very rarely seen, completely giving up all of his appeals. Whether this is a sign of true remorse or perhaps something more cynical, I'll leave that up to you to decide. By the time the first 911 caller had her phone in her hand, the white pickup was already past her, doing well over 70, and the passenger door was hanging open. The young woman who'd been in the cab a few seconds earlier was on the bridge deck behind it, and the man who'd put her there had no plans to stop. He was going to drive south, off the bridge, off the interstate, and completely off police radar, and for almost 5.5 years, that's exactly what he did. Carson Prince was 19 years old and the oldest of 3 children born to Tom and Suzanne Prince. Her father had served a term as the mayor of Little Rock in the mid-1980s, and her mother was a deputy prosecutor in the same city. By the spring of 1999, she'd stepped away from college for a semester and was living back home in Momel, a community on the north bank of the Arkansas River. She wanted to re-enroll for the fall term, and her family later said she'd been looking forward to it. On the morning of Wednesday, April 28, 1999, she told her father that she was driving into Little Rock to pick up registration paperwork. The family's housekeeper saw her leave a little before noon, and Carson was in her own car, alone. Unfortunately, Carson's car ran out of gas on Interstate 430, and that one small mechanical failure is what the rest of the story hangs on. She pulled to the shoulder, got out, and started walking back toward the nearest service station. It was Wednesday, just after lunchtime, on the busiest stretch of North-South Freeway in central Arkansas, and nothing about the situation was menacing yet. At the exact same time, Stephen Talley was driving past in a white Ford pickup. He was 33 years old, from the small town of Perryville, out in the wooded hill country west of Little Rock. By his own much later admission, he was on the hunt that morning, driving around looking for a woman to attack. Carson, walking the shoulder of a freeway in the middle of a sunny weekday, fit whatever twisted parameter he was using, and he pulled over and offered her a ride. She took the ride, and the social calculus around stranded motorists in 1999 hadn't yet hardened into the kind of stranger danger reflex we now have. In any case, she was only in his cab a few minutes before she realized something was very wrong. By Talley's later account, she figured it out almost immediately that he was no ordinary Good Samaritan trying to help out. She started talking fast, and she told him who her father was. She told him that if anything happened to her dad wouldn't let it go for the rest of his life. That promise, coming from the daughter of a former mayor and a sitting deputy prosecutor, seems to have unsettled Talley. Disturbingly, though, it also seems to have made him decide that whatever happened next, he couldn't let her walk away to tell what happened. Talley reached for a crescent wrench inside the cab and swung it at her head, but according to his account, she successfully fought back, taking advantage of the close quarters environment. He had a 9mm on him too, and in the next few seconds he reached for that as well. Carson, seeing what he was doing, lunged for the passenger door, but the truck was already on the bridge over the Arkansas River, accelerating rapidly. He braked hard. The door swung wide and she came out of the cab at highway speed. The witnesses who called 911 didn't see most of what was going on. What they saw was a pickup weaving across lanes at well over 70 miles an hour, a struggle through the windshield, and then a body coming out the side. She hit the concrete guardrail of the bridge at full speed, and the pickup didn't slow down. Talley kept south, off the bridge, off the interstate, and gone. State troopers and Little Rock police were on the scene within minutes. Paramedics rushed Carson to a Little Rock hospital, but the head injury from the guardrail and the speed had already ensured she wouldn't make it. A few drivers tried to keep their eyes on the truck as it continued south, but they eventually lost the vehicle. Witnesses gave investigators a rough description of the driver, a roughly 30-something white man at the wheel of an older white Ford pickup. That profile would fit thousands of other drivers across central Arkansas at any given hour of the day. The Prince family found themselves in the small, loud center of a public tragedy, with local media widely covering the case. Investigators circulated the truck and driver description almost immediately, asking anyone who'd been on that stretch of highway to call in what they remembered. Tip lines opened and a few drivers came forward with extra detail, a glimpse of the man, a sense of his rough age and build, but none of it was enough. For a few weeks, the Arkansas State Police were optimistic that they could crack the case quickly, since they had a vehicle description circulating on every news broadcast in the state. They also had a victim whose father knew exactly which phone calls to make to keep the pressure up. But despite all this, the truck didn't surface, the driver didn't slip, and nobody who knew Tally walked into a sheriff's office to say his name. By summer, the file was thick and going nowhere, and by the fall, it was a cold case. The Prince case became a recurring feature on national crime television. America's Most Wanted ran it, and then, in August 2002, the long-running series Unsolved Mysteries put together its own segment. Tip lines lit up after every broadcast, the way they always do when a story like this hits millions of households, and Arkansas detectives chased every plausible lead, but nothing held. In October 2004, more than 5 years after the slaying, Stephen Tally got into his truck around midnight on a Tuesday night and drove himself to the Perry County Sheriff's Department. He was 38 by then, and he'd been living quietly back home in Perryville the whole time, on the western edge of the search radius and just inside the next county line. Tally had decided that he now wanted to tell a deputy exactly what he'd done. He told them that he was responsible for the death of the young woman on the interstate bridge in the spring of 1999. He admitted on his own initiative that the reason he'd pulled over for her in the first place was that he'd been driving around looking for a victim, and she'd been the one who fit. This was a shocking admission, but there was more, and it turned out Carson hadn't been his only victim. On the morning of June 21st, 1999, less than 2 months after Carson's death, he'd crossed paths with a young couple from Perryville, Barbara Leggett and Christopher Barnes. By his account, he'd shot Barnes first, specifically so he could assault Leggett, and then strangled her with a length of twine and hidden her body. The couple had been on the books as missing for over 5 years, and no remains had ever been recovered. Tally said he could lead investigators to where Leggett was buried, and the next morning he did exactly that, walking deputies to a location in the woods only he could have known. 3 capital charges came down inside a week, and bizarrely, Tally first entered a not guilty plea. While he sat in the Perry County Jail awaiting whatever came next, another inmate, who reportedly knew one of the victims, severely beat him. He eventually changed his plea, and in June 2005, he was formally received into the Arkansas Department of Correction with a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. What never quite got explained, then or after, was why a man who had managed to stay invisible for more than half a decade decided to confess one evening. Nobody had gotten any closer to him in 5 years, and there was no new witness and no genetic hit. By every measure available to the public record, Stephen Tally was going to get away with all 3 crimes. Yet despite this, on a random Tuesday around midnight, he stopped getting away with them by his own choice. I personally like to believe that he had some sort of remorse for his sick actions, but that doesn't explain why he initially entered a not guilty plea. Anyway, let me know in the comments about your own theories about why Tally may have come forward. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy dropping in with a reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon, the membership, or the merch store if you want to take your support for my work to the next level. A sheriff's deputy on a slow morning patrol through a Virginia park kicked at a steamer trunk left like trash beside an overlook. It refused to budge an inch, and when he forced the lid open and dug through the duffel bag stuffed inside, an eye stared back at him. The man in the trunk was emaciated, half undressed, and recently deceased. For nearly 7 years after that, nobody on Earth would know who he was, and during all of that time, somebody else was still quietly cashing his Social Security checks. It was the early morning of May 14th, 1996, when a deputy with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office pulled into an overlook at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. The trunk wasn't hidden. It sat where someone had wanted it to look like dumped furniture, near a small heap of trash. The man inside hadn't been deceased for very long, maybe a day, maybe two at most. What the autopsy found was ugly. There were fresh cuts and abrasions on his skin, blunt force trauma to the back of his head, and toxic levels of a sedative in his bloodstream. The official cause was asphyxia, the kind that comes from a hand squeezing a throat, or something pressed over a face, or possibly both at once. There was no identification anywhere on him or in the trunk, as was to be expected. His fingerprints went to the FBI and turned up nothing in any of the limited databases that existed at the time. DNA testing in 1996 wasn't what it would later become, and he didn't match any missing persons report investigators could find. The only physical oddity on the trunk itself was a smear of nail polish on the outside, the kind of stray detail that means nothing until, years later, it means everything. Loudoun County deputies passed a composite image of his face to media outlets, and he was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but no one recognized him. And from there, the case went cold, and for years, it looked like nobody would ever know who this John Doe was, and for many years, that would remain the case. In time, it turned out that he was Jasper Frederick Watkins Jr., though everyone called him Jack. Born in Richmond in March 1920, he'd grown up in a part of Virginia that still remembered the antebellum South in living memory. In 1941, just a couple of weeks before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the United States Army. He came home after, took a steady job at an auto parts store, and settled into the kind of quiet, unremarkable adulthood that men of his generation tended to build one day at a time. In 1964, when he was 44, he married a 40-year-old divorcee named Mary Triplett. She brought 3 grown daughters into the marriage, and by all accounts they took to Jack like a real father rather than a stand-in. He and Mary stayed together for a quarter of a century, but she passed away in 1989, and Jack was alone again. By the mid-90s, he was retired and living on a fixed income of $1,200 a month in a small house in Reisterstown, just outside Baltimore. Then, one autumn day, a sinister woman came to his door selling cemetery plots, and his life would change in a very big way. Her name was Nancy Siegel, though she'd been born Nancy Schweitzer in Baltimore in 1948. Her mother walked out when she was small, and her father raised her until he was cut down outside a bar in 1964, leaving her effectively on her own at 16. She married her high school sweetheart in 1968 and had 2 daughters with him, but the marriage curdled in the 80s when she developed a serious gambling habit. She started opening loans and credit cards in her husband's name without telling him, and by the time they divorced in 1985, he was over $100,000 in debt. She married a second man soon after, used his identity for more loans, and even altered his mortgage checks so the money landed in her account instead of the bank's. Unsurprisingly, that marriage, to the extent that it was ever legitimate to begin with, ended in 1993. Then came November 21st, 1994, and Nancy was now working as a door-to-door burial plot salesperson. Personally, I wasn't aware that this was even a thing, and I really have to question why anyone would buy this sort of thing from a random person at your door. Nancy showed up at Jack Watkins' door to talk about some grave upgrades. almost certainly one for Mary, his former wife. According to one source, she was trying to upsell Jack from his wife's current grave to a fancy little mausoleum. Jack, for his part, had been widowed for 5 years, and he was lonely and ready to trust anyone kind. Within weeks, she was running his credit accounts. What happened to Jack Watkins from late 1994 to early 1996 reads like a slow-motion robbery dressed up as a romance. Within a month of meeting him, Nancy was using his existing credit cards for clothes, jewelry, and bigger purchases. She'd quietly rerouted his account statements to her own mailing address so he'd never see the bills. She opened new credit lines in his name, and by the summer of 1995, there were tens of thousands in fresh credit card debt and a $40,000 car loan for a fancy German car. She told friends and neighbors she and Jack were engaged, and he believed it. In August 1995, she convinced him to take a $44,000 mortgage out on his home, then use the cash to pay off 13 credit cards she'd run up in his name. A few months later, there was a second mortgage and another $20,000 handed over, so she could supposedly buy a condo for the two of them, but there was never any condo. By then, Nancy was already seeing the man who'd eventually become her third husband, a wealthy loan broker. In April of 1996, she finally sold Jack's house, and records show it went for $90,000, but Jack walked away with less than $4,000. The rest vanished into Nancy's debts, and he had almost nothing left to take. Now, this is the point where a typical con artist usually moves on, but Nancy Siegel didn't. Jack was a witness who could, in theory, walk into a police station and tell them everything she'd done. Worse, he was about to lose the last few things that had kept him compliant: his home and his independence. So she started building a different ending. By the spring of 1996, she was trying to have him committed to psychiatric care, claiming that he suffered from dementia. She also began selling off his remaining personal belongings, to the extent that he had anything left. Worse yet, she moved him into her own house, where she controlled what he ate, who he spoke to, and of course, what was in his bloodstream. The autopsy's toxic sedative levels weren't from a one-time dose, and she'd been drugging him and starving him for some time before the end. Sometime in the 48 hours before that trunk turned up beside the Appalachian Trail, she ended his life. She then packed his half-stripped body into a duffel bag, wedged it inside the trunk, and drove from Maryland across the state line into Virginia. There she dropped him beside a pile of trash at a quiet overlook, believing that she had gotten away with everything. Then she went home, kept right on cashing his Social Security checks, and acted as if nothing had happened. For the better part of a decade after Jack's death, Nancy Siegel kept the lights on by impersonating him. Social Security payments and a retirement annuity continued to flow to a post office box in Ellicott City, Maryland. She used his identity to open more credit. She married her third husband in December 1998 and quickly began bleeding him too, eventually defrauding him of around $300,000. Rather than turn her in when he caught on, he just paid off her debts and kept his mouth shut, apparently out of shame over the situation. The break came in January 2003 when the Department of Defense finally opened its internal fingerprint database to the FBI. The match was almost instant, and the man in the trunk was a veteran from Richmond, Virginia, last known to be living in Maryland. Once they had his name, the rest unraveled fast. Investigators traced the dead man's still active Social Security checks to that post office box in Ellicott City and set up a sting. In February 2003, Nancy Siegel walked up to the window and asked for her mail, and a postal inspector was waiting for her. She told them, with a straight face, that Jack was alive and well and living in Pennsylvania with a woman named Ruth. Then they watched her walk out, drive to a nearby bank, and deposit one of his Social Security checks. A database search showed an arrest history sprawling across enough jurisdictions that no single agency had ever stitched the pattern together. When they showed her a photograph of the trunk, she cried and called Jack a father figure she'd nursed through dementia. His medical records said he'd never been diagnosed with anything of the kind, and instead they revealed that she had been trying to get him diagnosed. She later tried to claim he did it to himself, saying that she walked in and found him hanging from a light fixture. Her own daughters cooperated with investigators, and one of them recognized the trunk in the crime scene photo on site. It had been hers, and she knew it by the nail polish stains on the lid. A federal grand jury indicted Nancy Siegel in January 2004 on charges that stacked her financial crimes against Jack, alongside her decision to silence him. What followed was 5 years of pretrial wrangling over what evidence would be admissible and what wouldn't be. The prosecution wanted everything from the bankrupted husbands to the credit cards run up in other people's names admitted to evidence. The defense, for their part, said that this would be too prejudicial to their client, and the judge initially sided with the defense. However, at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, after a long process, they disagreed and held that the evidence was almost all admissible. Simply put, they found that the probative value of the pattern as a whole outweighed the prejudicial effect upon the jury. After years of delay, the trial began in early March 2009 in Judge Andre Davis's downtown Baltimore courtroom. The case was handled by a team of assistant United States attorneys from the District of Maryland under U.S. Attorney Rod Rosenstein. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because he was the Deputy Attorney General from 2017 to 2019. The defense, for its part, was led by court-appointed attorney Jane Flanagan. The government's narrative was simple and devastating, and it's hard for me to imagine why this went to trial at all. The prosecution said Siegel had built her adult life on a rotating cast of victims, each one chosen, charmed, and drained until the next one came along. Jack Watkins was one mark in a longer chain. The difference was that Jack was about to lose his home, his savings, and his usefulness, and Jack could talk. The other men she had been involved with had, in essence, been controlled by their shame over the situation, but Jack had nothing to lose. Prosecutors walked the jury through the slow physical destruction of him at her Ellicott City apartment. They showed where she'd isolated him from friends and family, drugged him with a sedative the autopsy would later detect at toxic levels, and starved him. The medical examiner described the cause of death as neck compression, consistent with the prosecution's theory that Siegel had stood on Jack's throat until he stopped breathing. Now, usually I don't get into those kind of details, but honestly, I think it's necessary to state, to fully show the depths of Siegel's evil acts. The evidence came in from every angle, and bank records showed her depositing Jack's Social Security checks for the better part of a decade. The steamer trunk itself was identified on site by one of her own daughters, who recognized it by the nail polish stains on the lid. Her own statements to investigators were played back to the jury, including the laughable claim that Jack was alive and living in Pennsylvania with a woman named Ruth. Thanks to the Fourth Circuit's ruling, the panel also heard about the husbands left in 5 and 6 figures of debt, as well as her other nefarious activities. Across roughly 2 weeks of testimony, the defense did something few defendants do in a federal case of this size. They called no witnesses at all. Siegel herself didn't take the stand herself, though that shouldn't come as any surprise, because she would have been absolutely destroyed on cross-examination. Flanagan's strategy seems to have been to attack the chain of evidence from the cross-examination chair. She picked at the gaps in the government's circumstantial case for the slaying and hoped the jury would balk at returning a guilty verdict. In the industry, that's what we like to call a Hail Mary pass, and the jurors only needed 7 hours to find her guilty. A month later, on April 23, 2009, Siegel returned for sentencing, and by that time she was 61 years old. The judge handed down 400 months in federal prison, the equivalent of just over 33 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release and an order of full restitution. Nancy Siegel remains in prison today, and interestingly, after serving 18 years, she sought a release on quote-unquote compassionate grounds. Unsurprisingly, given the gravity of her lifetime of offenses, and in particular the disgusting way she treated Jack, this was denied.